It's great to be back with all of you. If you weren't able to join us for the first part of our forum last week, my name's Hannah Storm, and I'm a UK-based media consultant specialising in journalism safety, online, physical and emotional. And I'm the former director of the International News Safety Institute. It's a real privilege to be here today. I'll be co-emceeing this event with Yolande James in Montreal. Last week, we heard stories and conversations that shed light on the scale and extent of online threats targeting media professionals. Today, we'll get an even more detailed picture of how things stand. We'll be releasing the results of the first industry-wide survey on online harassment conducted in Canada. This session will be recorded so we can share the panelists' perspectives and suggestions for how we as an industry can respond. As a reminder, this event is bilingual with simultaneous interpretation. I'd also like to draw your attention to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We invite you to share feedback, thoughts, or questions throughout the event. Moderators will keep an eye on it and will share the information with me and Yolande. None of us can tackle the challenge of online harassment alone. It will take us all working together. So thank you again for being here. And now, Yolande, over to you.
So much, Hannah. For those of you who weren't here last week with us, my name is Yolande James, and I'm the Executive Director of Diversity and Inclusion at CBC. I will be co-hosting this forum from Montreal. I wish to first acknowledge that the land I am on is part of the current Kanien'kehá:ka territory, an unceded Aboriginal territory that has been home to several Aboriginal nations, in particular, the exchange time. Since this is a virtual event, I invite you to take the time to reflect on this issue, where you are, and on ways so that we can advance reconciliation efforts with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people across Canada. I'd like to reiterate that the purpose of today's session is to identify avenues for solutions and joint action. We saw last week the importance of transparency and solidarity in addressing the threat of online harassment. That's why we need better coordination across the industry, whether through sharing best practices or holding digital platforms and public authorities accountable. Today, we will discuss concrete ways to achieve this. We also want to agree on further appointments for the next steps. Now, without further ado, let's get to the heart
over to you
of the
to present
matter.
the first panel.
Thanks, Yolande. I'm joined now by 5 international esteemed news industry colleagues to talk about their approach to understanding online violence and supporting those they work with. Let me introduce you to
Grégoire Lemarchand, who is a chief writer at the Digital Investigation and helping with the central
Inga Forda,
writing at the Agence
executive editor of
France-Presse.
CNN Digital International. Karen Mahabir, fact-checking and misinformation editor at the Associated Press. Jason Reich, Vice President, Safety and Security for the New York Times. Nicole White, Social Media Wellbeing Advisor at the Australian Broadcasting Corporation.
Grégoire, may I begin with you? Can you please give us examples of measures that you took to, understand the experience of your colleagues and better support them? First of all, I'd just like to tell you that on my side, it's been 10 years that I'm working on cyber harassment for the Agence France-Presse. We're following this very closely. I will start by saying that I'm not very optimistic because I saw the situation really deteriorate for the last few years. And for 2 years almost now, the situation really worsened with the pandemic. The shock that has been created by the pandemic did not help the matter. So now we're finding that we're noticing that things are more and more violent. And especially for our team at Agence France-Presse, when we're doing a fact-checking or we're verifying misinformation and we're working on a lot of publications that are false, especially on the pandemic. We're noticing, it's been many years that we're working on fact-checking. We've never received that many threats. There's various levels of violence, but never we received so many messages to say that we journalists will be soon judged in an international tribunal like Nuremberg. So we're put on the same level as the worst criminals in the Nazi regime. So we don't want to stay with our arms, crossed and do nothing. So we want to do the maximum of things, but we don't want to be exhausted, explain everything that we're going to do. But we want to give you a few hints of what we noticed and that are allowing us to act so that we can, so that the harassment doesn't become a real nightmare for journalists. First of all, so never, minimize what's happening on the social media and to let this, the journalists know. Because oftentimes when they're harassed, journalists say, though, it's part of our job. So no, it's not part of the job. It's not normal to be insulted for our work. We can be criticized, yes, but not harassed. So we want to encourage journalists to tell us, wait, watch out. I was harassed, I was threatened, I received emails or other messages of threats. This is very important because there's a hierarchy and that the editors-in-chief really know what's going on. And again, it's not part of your job description. So when we're looking at to take care of this harassment issue, there's no magic wand. There's no one-size-fits-all. And there needs to be a solution that's personalized to every problem. So we have to let everyone know that it's not normal to be insulted. So it's very important to repeat that. We also have to be proactive when we're basically working with the journalists and to identify the people who are the most at risk. So I will say that are pretty logical, but when we're international agency, we're everywhere in the world. So it's certain regions that are more complicated than others. For example, the United States, where everything extremely polarized. So people that are doing fact checking. And it's also, unfortunately, a lot of journalists for 10 years are very active on social media, do have a tendency to say a lot of things on the social media, and they have a tendency also to say too many things on social media, whether it's personal or opinions or comment or ironic. So oftentimes it's not understood. So unfortunately, are giving the stick to be beaten. So we do have to set rules to express yourselves on the social media. So that doesn't mean that journalists are not allowed to speak, but they have to be careful with what they're sharing. And to end, we also have to, it's very important, and it goes back to what I said, we have to let them understand that there's we have to say when something happens, and we can't hesitate to act. We can, mention the person on social media. There's various mechanisms to help us. I don't want to list them all, but we don't want to hesitate. We don't want them to hesitate to go further. And by using, police, for example, let's be careful. We have to adapt ourselves. We have to study things, but sometimes it would be very useful also because it could stop completely something. When someone is called by the police, it could change everything. It could calm them, in a radical fashion. So I just want to end my comment by saying it's obviously something that has to be done in perfect harmony with the journalist that is involved, and do not take measures without informing him and without his agreement or her agreement, because it could work against him or her. And we have the example. We spoke to the police in France for a very severe cyber bullying, and it unfortunately only worsened the situation. Thank you so much.
We heard from Gregoire there that this idea of, and it's something we're trying to underline here at the forum, it's not normal to be harassed as part of your job. unfortunately, it has become something we're seeing increasingly so, and that we need to take proactive steps there as organizations to support those at risk. So at CNN, you spent a lot of time considering the pre-planning that can be done to support journalists who are at risk. Can you talk us through what you've been doing in that regard?
Yeah, hi, thank you for having me here to talk about this incredibly important topic. We have sort of found that it's not enough for us just to react to when the abuse happens and and start from that point. So we have now sort of built into our workflow on topics where we suspect or have experience of abuse happening, that we built in a specific kind of questions and process that is supposed to help our journalists. So, I mean, first of all, I think, the topics are not, a surprise to anyone, anything related to gender or gender equality, LGBTQ, the trans community, even certain regions in the world, Russia, China being some of them, but we are also, for example, recently had a lot of trolling of our people around Nigeria and Ethiopia, where we have been doing some very important, strong journalism. So what we basically do as part of our sort of work is in the pre-planning is that when we've decided when we're going to program the piece, we will have a discussion with the reporter and say to them, we suspect that there could be trolling or abuse online from this. We then talk about, are you going to tweet the story? Are we going to switch off the comments? How do you want your byline on the piece if there's a danger of that happening? We also talk about if this should be put out on CNN accounts. And if we decide to put it out on CNN accounts, and the reporter is obviously always part of this discussion, do we mention them? Do we give the @handle of the reporter? Because that's more likely to lead to personal abuse than just the abuse of the company. We also talk about if comments should be on or off and what that means. And then on the day of publication, we assign a specific editor that is just their main job is to check in with this reporter, look at what is happening. We also offer that this reporter can just delete any of these social media platforms from their phones and that we will monitor them. The editor will monitor them or our safety team will monitor them. So that they don't have to. I mean, we've had people sort of waking up in different time zones, to, torrent of abuse because their stories were suddenly picked up by other parts of the world, for example. So we always say, you can switch it off and we can then, have a conversation and talk through what might have happened while you slept or since publication. And we obviously specifically mentions that we talk about. Then I think the third sort of main area to highlight is around security checks. I think doxing is becoming an increasingly big problem. So making sure that, prior to any publication that the handles are secure and they're safe, that their location or any personal information can't be taken from it. We try to do as much as we can sort of around that. So, I mean, the purpose of all of this is that things shouldn't come as a surprise to the reporter. We've put in place a system that supports from the very offset, and that obviously, it's very clear when it needs to be highlighted to security checks or even up to our legal teams. But those are the sort of pre-planning work that we've been doing here at CNN.
Thanks, Inga. Thank you for that. It does remind me somewhat of when we're sending journalists into hostile environments, the kind of idea of the risk assessment that we've done in the past. And we spoke last week about this and just how similar many of the steps that we need to take to support journalists are. I'll come back to you on a question in a moment, Inga, but in a few minutes. Thank you, Inga. Karen, to you. At the Associated Press, you recently carried out a listening tour to get a better sense of the extent and scale of the violence that was affecting your colleagues. Can you tell us a little bit more about what it looked like and what you learned?
Yes, I'm happy to. And thank you so much for inviting me onto this panel. I'm so glad you're doing it. I really can't think of a more important issue to be focused on in newsrooms right now. So, at the AP, we felt that one of the most important and valuable steps we could take to address online harassment in our global newsroom was to give our staffers everywhere a chance to be heard about what they were going through and what mattered to them and what steps they wanted the AP to take. So we did conduct this listening tour over the summer that involved more than 24 hour-long sessions across time zones with hundreds of people, where we had very frank and honest conversations and learned what folks were experiencing around social media and online harassment. And then we also provided surveys in case people wanted to bring things up confidentially. And, we really learned some interesting things through that. For example, that a lot of cases simply weren't being reported, and there were many reasons for that. Some people didn't know what constituted harassment. Others said they were too embarrassed about the graphic nature of the images or the comments that they had received to bring it up with their manager. Some said that they didn't know just where to go or who to talk to in the newsroom, or like Ragaj said, they thought it was just part of the job. And in some instances, these harassment cases had been going on for years. So after the listening tour and the sessions, we did a lot of research internally but also externally with groups that are doing tremendous work in this space, like PEN America, which works with many newsrooms, to find out just how others were going about this and what the best practices were. And then every week we would put everything on the table and discuss with our top news leaders what we were learning and how we could synthesize those learnings into steps that we might want to take to help our staff. And so among the things that we're now thinking of is creating easy ways for people to report harassment, by email or by Slack, which can be done from the field, or by phone, if for those who want to discuss their case one-on-one with someone. And then we think having a group of people who are ready and can respond quickly to help document those cases, by going through those troubling messages on the person's behalf is really important. Also, what came out of those sessions is the idea perhaps to have a database to log those cases, which would help us identify, repeat offenders, such as the same person targeting multiple people in different areas of the company over time. It would also allow us to be more proactive about harassment. For example, if we can identify the stories or the topics where we've seen an uptick in harassment cases, then maybe we can take steps to help protect our writers and our editors before they publish a story on that same topic, very much in line with Inga's good guidance. And almost in the same way that you would try to protect yourself before going into a potentially physically dangerous situation. And then lastly, we're looking into training programs, for all staff, including managers, who also said that they needed a lot of help here to identify harassment, to learn ways on like how to respond to it, and how to protect yourself online. So I think, just, having a system that involves listening, easy ways to report, and people who can help address cases in real time seem like really good first steps that any newsroom might want to take to help their staff.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you so much. And it must have been incredibly eye-opening for you to run those listening sessions and hear instances, as you said, of people having been harassed for such a long period of time. I'm going to come back to you afterwards on the manager's question specifically, but if I could move on to Nicole. And thank you for joining us from Australia, where it's the middle of the night, and we're hugely grateful for this being such a global conversation and for you staying up to talk with us, Nicole. You've got a particularly unique job title in the industry, the Social Media Wellbeing Advisor at the ABC in Australia. Tell us a little bit more about that, how that role came about and how you're supporting your colleagues.
Thanks for having me. So the role was created about 12 months ago, really to craft strategy for how we both prepare for and respond to incidents. And I sit within the health, safety and wellbeing team and provide advice and support to staff, but also our external contributors to our content who are experiencing online harm. So that support is through both personal intervention in the midst of an incident and also building resources to help empower others, be it management or journalists themselves. And as I said, that goal is really about empowerment with a particular focus on our diverse staff and female staff, managers and producers, making sure that they have the information, training, risk management approaches, and sort of steps to mitigate that risk as well. And so aside from creating, a raft of those resources, I think it's really important to note what this signals to an organisation, having someone in this role. It signals that the ABC takes it seriously and that there's a willingness to help. And I think if anyone tuned into the first session, Julie Passetti was talking about the fact that it is massively underreported, and we've heard that mirrored here today as well. And so having someone in that role dedicated is just a massive step to increasing conversation and for staff to feel safe, I guess, to come forward and that they will be supported. So my initial focus has really been on creating clear guidelines for when incidents occur. There was really great things happening in pockets around the organisation, but really just formalising that and creating some best practice around the basics. And as Gregor said, it isn't that there is a one size fits all. Every situation is really different, but just allowing for that shared knowledge so that people know who to contact, when to engage security, when to engage psychological support or potentially the supports that are available, be it through our peer support system or our employee assistance program, which provides counselling to staff. And we have trained some of those psychologists on what these incidents look like, which is really important as well, because if you have staff accessing psychological support, but the psychologist turns around and says, well, I don't know what a pylon is, it isn't particularly helpful. So that's been a really important role as well, is increasing the education both internally and externally about what this looks like so that staff can be supported. We have a traffic light system as well that organises threats into high, medium and low, and there's advice for each level. So it's really clear amidst the chaos of an incident, some of the key steps to take to make sure that you have your support bolstered from, as I said, security, myself, we have a trauma programs manager, and that we can all come in and assist. And again, we're also, as Inga said, looking at preparing as well. So risk mitigation, risk assessments. We run social media self-defense training that's available on demand, and just making sure that staff are prepared for exposure to an audience that's larger and online when they're coming on, and also that contributors to our programs are prepared for the same, and some key steps around that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Nicole. And I'm really struck by the idea that, you know, often when we're speaking with people, particularly perhaps managers, we feel like we don't speak the same language, and that idea of being educating managers and educating the therapists that you use as well to be able to speak that language, I think is incredibly important. So thank you for sharing that. I will come back to you if you don't mind staying on with us for a little bit longer. Can I just remind people that about the Q&A facility, you do have the capability to ask questions if you'd like. We'd very much welcome your questions indeed. Please do use the Q&A button at the bottom. Jason, you and I have been speaking about journalism safety probably for the best part of a decade, and online violence for a lot of that time frame as well. How has your thinking changed in terms of how we can support our colleagues who are most at risk in that time?
Thank you, Anna, and also thank you to the CBC for this excellent panel. I would start by saying that my thinking is always changing. Even this past year, I think we've begun to rethink some of our approaches and our responses. Let me start. I think a decade is a helpful term, a helpful frame of time. Let me start by saying that a decade ago, we were beginning to look at, I think, the first shift in how we approached online threats, abuse, and harassment was understanding that as an institution, reflexively, we have a lot, we're all free speech organizations. We're all about the discourse and the exchange of ideas. And in all of our institutions, there's this thinking that we have to be open to criticism. And I think generally speaking, 10 years ago, or even earlier than that, people who were critiquing our institutions were doing so because they wanted us to be better. They had strong, passionate views on a specific topic, and they felt like we weren't doing it justice. And so a lot of the feedback, even if it was, in today's terms, we would call it aggressive trolling or harassment or abuse. I think that underneath of that was a goal that was saying we're seeking this version of the truth or this narrative to have a stronger say. What's changed then, which I think is troubling, is that today there are those who just simply want to destroy what the media represents. They're not acting in good faith, and their attacks are actually intended to silence us. It's not really to promote some sort of a narrative or an idea. It's not trying to say, oh, we think that, you're not giving enough attention to this group and you're instead giving attention to this group. They're actually just simply trying to make us stop doing the work that we're doing. So the first conceptual shift was understanding that some of these people are not interested in the exchange of ideas. In fact, they're just interested in weakening us as institutions. And that was difficult, I think, for a lot of organizations to recognize at first. And it still is difficult because it's just so hard as an institution to thread and figure out what is feedback that needs to be listened to, even if it's hard, even if it's passionate, and what is what I would call part of this bad faith attempt to just weaken us as institutions. The second change, and this is a little bit more recent, and it's a bit of a shift. If I'm getting now into the tactics maybe for a second, but we used to say we don't want to respond to every little thing because we might be giving oxygen or feeding the trolls, etc. I still think that that's a principle that has some value, but I'm not quite as dogmatic about it as I used to be, and that is because of feedback similar to, I'm sure this type of listening tour that the AP's done, we've done work like this as well. And what we've heard from a lot of staff is that they want to feel supported by their institution, right? And they want the institution to stand up for them, even if it is just, I say that in quotes, even if it is a troll and someone where we normally would say, oh, we don't want to give oxygen to this argument because it's clearly in bad faith. But the employee wants to feel supported, and the employee wants to know that the institution has its back. So where we are right now, and this is a constantly evolving recipe, is we're trying to balance the mix of, is this criticism that we need to address as an institution and that we need to think about and accept, and also how is our response going to impact our employees' well-being and the resilience of our own newsroom. And so do our employees feel like we support them? Do our employees feel like, as you started with, Hannah, which is a great point, is this just part of the job? Or is it actually understood from a company perspective that no, this isn't part of the job and we don't accept this behavior? So I think that that's really where my current thinking is shifting. And I imagine next time we meet, it'll be probably something new as well.
Thank you so much, Jason. And last week we heard about the fact that online harassment is silencing journalists and therefore it's impacting on press freedom. And I think that the point you made there about that move from constructive criticism, if you like, towards making media better to people wanting to shut up journalists is a really, really important point that you've made there, Jason. So thank you. Grégoire, si je peux poser une question supplémentaire.
Grégoire, can I ask you an extra question? The Agence France-Presse just asked for for editors, chief editors, for online harassment. Can you suggest some measures? Thank you, Hannah. One of the steps that seems important to us, for example, on which I will insist, a lot of colleagues are living in the illusion that we should master the digital world. We have less and less of journalists that cannot use the internet, but they're thinking that they have to. Oh no, they think they are mastering that environment, but sometimes they're victims of harassment, of massive trolling online. They're realizing to what degree people who have bad intentions can find information on them. Their doxing techniques, for example. Today, when you have bad actors that want to hurt you, they are ready to spend a lot of time. And we have we leave a lot of digital secretions. We don't have journalists with 400 photos. Journalists understand they had to close this, but we still leave a few traces of where we've gone and what we've said and done. When people master the techniques of online investigations, they will go a lot above typing your name in Google, for example. They'll find a lot of information. A lot of journalists were harassed, where people did not only found family photos and telephone numbers, emails, and we put this on the social media, and imagine what that created. Some people were convinced that they were people that were 30 and 40 years, they know internet very well. They were shocked still, everything that they didn't understand. So that's something that we really have to educate journalists in that way. It's complicated because I'm a little bit mean, but they have the illusion that understanding the digital, but usually that they're fooled. So we're trying to show them that, you know, with a few investigation techniques, and we're not like pirating, we're not into data leaks and all that. We're just talking about still not for Hollywood, like what we see in Hollywood, I mean, but we can find a lot of things with just a medium level of internet. So, and then we're giving them the stick with which to beat us. So that's a little bit sad because we can no longer do anything. Well, not nothing, but we have to be very vigilant. And I would feel that the first measure is the most important to do is really to have a digital hygiene, you know. So that means that in your environment, everything is clean. People think that it's clean, but it has a little, you know, leftover, sorry.
Merci beaucoup, Grégoire. Merci. Nicole, if I could follow up with you in terms of how important is it for the action taken at newsrooms or by newsrooms to be top down? And what role specifically can managers play in this regard?
Yeah, I think one of the largest challenges I've found in my role is still having people report when they're experiencing abuse. And I think that comes back to the fact that previously media organizations as a whole haven't always been particularly responsive. I know in research we've seen that they've told staff that they need thicker skin or asked them what they did to invoke the attack. And so understandably, some journalists are really hesitant still to share their experiences for even fear that their performance might be questioned due to online abuse. And so I think in order to just build that trust, we really, really need this to come from the top down. Managers really need to be visibly discussing this. It can be at editorial meetings, bringing this up, asking staff what they're exposed to build that trust and engage staff on this, and as well as actively promoting support mechanisms as well. And, you know, events like this go a really long way, I'm sure, to signal to your staff that you're taking this really seriously. And I highly, highly recommend newsrooms to just keep the conversation open and provide a safe space for staff to come forward.
Thank you very much, Nicole. And I'm very struck by the point you made there, and it really does corroborate what Julie said last week about this idea that sometimes, and we know this also with gender-based violence, sometimes people who suffer these experiences are made to feel like they are either a liability or it's up to them to solve the issue and they're to blame for this. And so the fact that you've highlighted that people are not to blame for this experience and that managers need to kind of open up and hold a space for journalists to be able to come forward without repercussions is incredibly, incredibly important. Karen, I'm going to come to you now. It's interesting. I was facilitating a conversation around mental health earlier this morning in the UK, and we were talking about how often journalists become managers without any kind of specific training to support their colleagues and also to support themselves. And there's a degree of crossover, isn't there, in terms of the kind of everything to do with safety, physical, online, and emotional as well. How do we sensitize or help sensitize managers to kind of hold that space for their colleagues?
Well, I couldn't agree more with what Nicole said. I think that, you know, the best thing that we can do and that any newsroom can do is to create an environment where people feel comfortable talking about this, right? Like, you need to know what the problem is before you can address it. And so I think that one of the things that we can do to support managers is simply training them, right? Letting them know what is online harassment and then how to be empathetic when a staffer does come to you with a problem. And I think that managers should follow up on that. It should never just be a single conversation. It should be an ongoing conversation. Secondly, I would say that I think that, you know, managers need to know how to assess threats and document them. And there should be some kind of internal reporting process so that managers themselves know who to escalate matters to in the greater newsroom, so that they too feel like they're not alone in this. I also think that, you know, it's important for managers to be really proactive about online harassment. You know, they should be really encouraged to have conversations with staffers before they do stories that might invite harassment. You know, to talk to staffers about how they're doing, you know, before, during the assignment and afterwards. And I think that that would really help managers really identify with like what's going on and keep that intimacy and that trust between managers and staffers.
Thanks, Karen. And let's not forget that it's been an incredibly stressful period of time for many in management as well. And this point that you said about managers also need to feel supported as well. We've spoken a lot about staffers in the last 20 minutes or so. I do want to ask you, Jason, specifically, you are on the advisory board of ACOS Alliance, which stands for A Culture of Safety, and that supports freelancers. What specific measures should we be thinking about, Jason, as an industry to support our freelance colleagues?
Well, I think one of the principles that ACOS stands behind is we should try and provide as many of the same protections we would afford to a staffer to a freelancer. I would emphasize to everyone here that this is one of those rare areas where there aren't sort of extra costs associated with the extra support. I mean, obviously it's time and attention, but a freelancer deserves that certainly from the management. And so the idea that you should be able to offer the same degree of support, especially management support, to a freelancer who's working for you. And they should feel encouraged to be able to discuss the issues as they're coming up with the organization, and it should be made clear to them what the sort of the same escalation tree that Karen is describing is necessary, because a freelancer isn't going to know. And so, you know, when we're first engaging with somebody on a story that we view may be challenging, we make sure that the manager explains, by the way, if this tends to blow up, like, here's an email address that you can use, and here are some people that you can contact. And it's just about setting these things up in motion. And again, I want to emphasize that the ACOS Alliance tries to find areas where it's win-win, you know, easy wins, where you can provide the assistance needed to help freelance journalists, and it's not as complicated as trying to put them onto, you know, a boutique insurance policy or something like that. This is really just making sure they have the right phone number of the right manager.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you ever so much for that. Inga, I'll save the last question for you, Inga. And this potentially feeds into the next panel that we're going to hear from. How important is it that we're able to work together as an industry to set aside differences?
I mean, I think it's really important. And I think, I mean, I'm often on panel with my colleagues from other parts of the industry where we have heated debates about approaches. On this one, I think we are absolutely united. There's nothing that has been said here today that I don't fully and wholeheartedly agree with. So I think that there is, you know, no differences to get past, really. The question is, what actions can we take? How can we sort of collectively be more powerful voice in speaking out about this, to hold those that can do something about it to account? And by that, I mean, some of the platforms, you know, there's even governments that are behind this in certain parts of the world. So I think that the more we can show the collective power of the media and speak out about this, the more successful we will inevitably be. And can I just quickly, Hannah, thank you for raising the sort of gender violence that comes out of this, because that is, I think, a really, really important issue for Newsroom to tackle. That, you know, the threats against women journalists are often incredibly graphic, very, very personal, often more violent. And I think that we need to start being comfortable discussing that at a much greater length, you know, talking about rape or doing something to your children or your body, or even what we would consider to be low level about, you know, what you look like or something, can be really hurtful. And so I think recognizing the differences or the gender differences in the abuse is critical for, you know, as we go forward. And, you know, and I think for leaders just to be comfortable discussing that, for a male leader in a newsroom to be able to feel like they can walk up to their reporter, a female reporter, and say, I see there are threats of rape here, you know, and understand just what that does for women is very important.
Thank you, Inga. And that's an incredibly important and powerful point on which to end, I think. I'm so grateful to all of you for giving your time to be with us today. The way that you came together from across the globe really underscores the commitment that you have for the work you're doing in your organizations and the work we can do together. Thank you. Merci beaucoup. And over to you, Yolande.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup, Hannah.
Thank you very much, Anna.
Je dois vous dire, What an amazing panel and powerful conversation. This shows us that wherever we are in the world, we share common experiences. And from this can sprout a common will to act within the industry. In a little while, we will be able to view the results of the online hatred survey in the media world in Canada. We're very excited and we can hardly wait for the results. This survey was done with the journalists and also media professionals belonging to several organizations in the country, whether in the public or public sector. It is the first time that we have launched such a study in Canada. Prior to viewing the result of the survey, we have the privilege to see the different reactions and comments of different person working in the media world. I'm going to introduce them to you. Irene Gentle,
VP of Inclusion and Strategic Partnership at Torstar. Welcome, Irene. Marie-Andrée Chouinard, rédactrice en chef du Devoir. Bonjour, Marie-Andrée. Kenny Yum, Senior Director of Innovation and Partnerships at CBC News. Hi, Kenny. As well as Brent Jolly, President of the Canadian Association of Journalists and Managing Director of the National News Media Council. Merci. Thank you. Merci, Brent. Malheureusement, nous devions
unfortunately, Jean-François Racine was supposed to be with us for the professional Quebec Association. He was supposed to come with us, but he had a conflicting schedule. He could not be with us, but I'm very pleased to host you too, and I'm impatient to know your ideas and your reactions. First, we're going to see the survey. Sébastien Dallaire, Director for CBC Canada. Ipsos. Here you have the floor to provide us with the results.
Hi, everyone. So I will present this in both languages. I'll try not to go from French to English too often to make sure that everybody can follow more easily. It's great that I have a chance to present those findings after the first panel, because as you'll see, the results are highly representative of a lot of what we've heard in the past during the first panel. The survey results are for Canada, as was just mentioned. So to give you a sense of what we did, we've talked to just over 1,000 journalists and media workers who are members of the 12 organizations that are on the right side of your screen. These are participating members, associations, and bodies who've helped us recruit all participants, who've helped us contact them via email to take part in this study. The study lasted approximately 15 minutes. It was conducted very recently, late September to mid-October. And important for you to know that what we're presenting today is we're just going through a summary of some of the findings and not the whole report, which will be made available through CBC's website. And if we look at who took part, just to give you a sense of who answered the survey, it wasn't only journalists or hosts. It's about 65% of those who respondents were journalists or hosts, so those who have more public-facing roles. We also talked to people in management. We also talked to people who played various roles, photographers, videographers, camera people. And we wanted to also cover both official languages in Canada, which we've done well. The percentages add up to more than 100%, simply because some people work in both languages. So it wasn't necessarily strictly in English or strictly in French. We asked them in what languages they usually did their work. De manière peu surprenante,
this will not surprise you after what we have heard. I'm going to show you the great lines, and we'll come back to the details afterwards. Harassment is really widespread online, though it can happen physically as well. The harassment at work has important consequences, as much for the person and also for the whole industry. Most of the harassment cases are not being reported. That also was mentioned earlier by the panelists. Many of them say, oh, it was not that serious, so I preferred not to mention it. Or, I have other things to do. This is very important because there's a lack of action there. Most of the victims have consulted no resource, and very often people who consulted these resources did not find them sufficient. There's a will to provide, to receive more support and resources in such a situation. What can be seen here on this graph in blue, dark blue, this is the frequency of harassment during the past 12 months. If you consider the first category, during the past 12 months, 65%, that means 2/3 of the respondents mentioned having been victim of online harassment during the past 12 months. The darker, the most frequent. Some people say it's daily. Some 14% say it's weekly, 14% say it's monthly. Some say it is less often, though it is 2/3 of the people during the past 12 months. This is also for the report. This is a summary. In the detailed report, you will see more details for the subgroup and more results. Though the most vulnerable groups are the most victims. This issue is therefore more severe, whether it's sexual harassment, gender identity, and so forth. Also, the women are more targeted, which is obviously connected to their gender and their person. Therefore, the attacks are more personal and more aggressive as well. If you consider the subcategories, even for threats or harassment in person, it is more than 1/3 of the people who face that over the past year. So just imagine what it is for people who have done this work for 25 or 30 years. Threats or harassing by phone, again, over 1/4 of the respondents, and physical aggression, 9%. And again, that is during the past year, in a time of pandemics, which means that people were less present in person. These results are really important. When we ask people if they can perceive changes in the past 2 years, did things decrease, increase? So the blue show people who say that the issue has increased. That means the online harassment, 3/4 of the respondents say it is way worse than before. During the panel, we could hear that this phenomenon has been present for several years. So this trend keeps increasing. It for sure goes in the wrong direction. You can see again, it's the same thing for the different categories. There's been an increase. The gray bar on the right-hand side represents people who say, I do not want to take position, or I do not know, and so forth. Among the ones who provide us with their opinion, we can largely see that there's been
Le type de harcèlement vécu au cours des derniers mois, c'est quand même assez varié.
There's been
Et
a
là,
decrease.
je ne présente pas
Here
tous les
you can see all
résultats
the
par sous-groupe. Ce qui
diverse
est en
results
mauve,
by
ce
subgroup.
sont
What
les
you can
choses qui sont
see in
reliées plus
purple
à
is what
du
is
harcèlement
more
plus de nature sexuelle ou vulgarité. Et là, ce sont
sexual
effectivement plus les
harm.
femmes,
Therefore, it
les
is
gens membres
more
de la communauté LGBTQ2+, qui
women
sont plus
who
souvent
are more
victimisés dans ce cas-là.
victimized in such
Mais
cases.
donc,
So 34%
34% au
in
total
total
de ceux qui nous disent avoir été victimes
mention
ont
having been
été victimes
victim
de
of
préjudices sexuels
sexist
quelconques.
comments
Si
of one
on
kind or
pense à
another. When we
l'identité, à la
think about
réputation,
identity,
c'est
reputation, it is
53% qui ont été
53% who
victimes d'une
mention
forme de
being
harcèlement reliée à
victim
ça,
of
que ce soit
a form of
manipulation de notre
harassment, whether it's
identité,
identity
usurpation
theft or
de comptes
usage of
médias
social
sociaux,
medias,
commentaires
negative
négatifs qui
comments,
ciblent notre origine ethnique,
etc.,
notre nationalité, notre
or
identité de
gender
genre. Et
identity.
systématiquement, ce sont les groupes les
Again,
plus vulnérables
systematically,
qui
the most
nous rapportent
vulnerable
avoir été victimes
groups
de harcèlement
report more
dans
harassment
ces
in
catégories-là.
such categories.
Et aussi, préjudice
There's
concernant la vie
also,
privée et la sécurité.
harm
Ben, on voit
regarding
renseignements
privacy
personnels
and
qui ont été
safety.
exposés,
There's
utilisation
been
de
the
notre
use
identité
of
sans
our
notre
identity
autorisation.
without
Il y a
authorization.
vraiment
So
des
there's
choses quand même
some
assez graves.
really
Et
major
si on passe la
issues.
liste au
If you
complet, ben,
can
il y a aussi une
review the
menace de
whole
mort
list,
pour
there's also 13%
des
for
gens.
death
Donc,
threats.
des choses très sérieuses
These are
qui
serious
ont
facts
été
that are
rapportées
being
par
reported by
les
the
répondants.
participants.
Et comme je le mentionnais,
As I mentioned
les
to
groupes les plus
you
vulnérables
again,
sont souvent
the
les plus
vulnerable
affectés
groups are the
par
most
le
impacted
harcèlement en
by
ligne.
online
Et
harassment.
de manière non surprenante pour tous les répondants, ce sont les journalistes ou les
As for the respondents, it's
annonceurs
the animators
qui sont
and
les plus
journalists who
susceptibles
are the
d'être victimes de harcèlement,
most
ceux qui ont le plus
susceptible to be
de contact
targeted
direct avec
because they have
leur
more of a
audience.
direct contact with their audience.
Et
What
donc, quels sont
are
les
the
facteurs qui
main
mènent
factors
au
leading
harcèlement? Et
to
là, c'est important de
harassment?
voir
This is
parmi les
important to
6
review the
premiers,
first
ceux qui
6
vraiment se détachent du
categories,
lot, où une majorité
where you can
de
see
gens nous ont
most of
dit
the
que ça
people
faisait
were saying
partie de ce qui a causé le
that was
harcèlement.
part of
C'est
the
relié à l'emploi.
what
Ce n'est
created
pas
the
quelque
harassment. It
chose
is
de
connected
personnel
to
ou
the
relié à qui nous
employment.
sommes, malgré
It is
tous
not
les types
connected
de
to
harcèlement
who
qu'on
we
vient de voir,
are,
qui sont, eux, très
even though
personnels.
there are
Souvent, c'est
lots of
vraiment une
different
attaque
types of
envers la
harassment
personne,
towards the
envers
person or
l'identité.
the
Mais le
identity.
point
The
de
starting
départ, c'est
point,
plutôt
though, is
le fait d'être journaliste,
more
le fait de
and simply the
travailler
fact to be a
pour
journalist and to be working
une
within a
organisation
media
médiatique. C'est ça
organization.
qui
This
est
is
vraiment
the
le point de
starting point.
départ, ou encore
Or
le fait de parler de certains
that could
sujets qui
be
soulèvent la
the fact to
controverse,
talk
qui
about
soulèvent des
controversial
réactions plus émotives de la
topics
part
which trigger
des gens
reaction by
qui vous
people.
lisent, qui vous entendent, qui vous voient. Et vous
You can
voyez
see
en
here in
mauve
purple
à
55%
55%
that
que la
COVID
COVID joue
obviously
un rôle dans
has
tout ça.
played
Ça,
a
c'est
role, a
une
major
large
role.
majorité des gens qui nous disent avoir
Most
été
people say
victimes
that they
de
have been
harcèlement nous disent
victim
que ben, la
of
COVID en a fait
harassment,
partie,
and they
ou la
say
COVID
that
ou
the
la
COVID was
vaccination,
part of
tout le
it, the
débat
vaccination,
sur
all
la
the
pandémie
debate
fait partie
about
de
the
la raison.
COVID
Et
is
donc,
at
pour le reste, comme je
stake.
disais, c'est des groupes
For
plus
the rest,
petits,
the
mais ça ne
groups are
change pas le
smaller,
fait,
the
des proportions plus petites,
proportions
pardon, mais
are,
ça ne change pas le fait qu'en bout de
though
ligne,
in
c'est
the
souvent
end,
là où le
this
harcèlement
is where
se répercute
there
le plus, parce que
there's
le harcèlement devient très
there are the
personnel.
most
On peut,
impacts
peut-être,
due to
les gens qui
harassment because
harcèlent
the
vont
harassment would be
lancer
very
leurs attaques
personal
en fonction
according to
du
the
sujet
topic
couvert ou en
covered,
fonction du média,
for
des
example.
médias en tant que tels,
And
mais
so
ça
these
devient personnel
attacks
très
turn into personal very quickly.
Et ça représente bien ce qu'Ipsos mesure un
This
peu partout
Ipsos
dans le monde.
measure
Ici,
reflects
sur la droite, vous voyez les résultats. On a un
the
indice de confiance
global
mondial. Voici
result.
pour les
You can
résultats
see a
pour le
global
Canada
index
démontrent que
here.
les
We have the
journalistes
journalists in
sont quand
Canada.
même
You can see
relativement bas sur la liste des professions
we're
les
pretty
plus
low
respectées,
among the
dans lesquelles on a
most trusted
confiance,
profession,
donc à
26%
26%
for
pour le
Canada.
Canada. Et c'est un constat
This,
qu'on voit
the
partout dans le monde.
finding
Ce n'est
can
pas
be
seulement au
noticed
Canada, dans les
everywhere
autres
else
pays
in the
où le
world, not
sondage
only
est
in
fait, c'est
Canada.
29, je crois. C'est un
This
constat
has
qu'on
been
remarque depuis
noticed for
plusieurs
the
années. Il y a une
past
perte de confiance
quite a few
envers
years. There's
les
a loss
journalistes,
of trust
mais
in
là,
the
c'est important, c'est une
journalists.
perte de confiance qui est généralisée
And
envers à peu
this
près toutes les
is
institutions.
this loss of
Donc,
trust
c'est vraiment un problème
concerns
majeur
all the
et le
different
titre,
organizations. So
donc le
this
thème
issue is
du
major,
panel,
and the
du
theme of
panel
the
aujourd'hui,
panel
du
here
colloque, sur
is important.
parler de l'impact sur la
Talking about
démocratie,
the
c'est très important
repercussions
parce
on
qu'effectivement,
democracy is
ça a un impact extrêmement
an important topic because yes, there are repercussions. especially when there's a lack of trust by the citizens toward the democratic institution and the media institutions.
Maintenant, les expériences vécues,
Now,
ici, je ne
we're
passerai pas en détail
talk
toutes
about
les actions,
the
mais vous
lived
voyez que la
situations.
panoplie, quand on demande aux gens qui ont été victimes, avez-vous pensé au cours de la dernière, au cours de la dernière année à
We
faire
asked the
une des
victims
choses
if they thought
suivantes
of
et on voit
doing
qu'il
this
y a
or that
beaucoup,
over the past year.
justement, où est-ce que vous avez subi certaines choses.
And for example,
Donc,
you can see
difficulté à
that they have
dormir,
sleep
ils ont des problèmes de
disturbances,
santé
mental health
mentale,
issues, they feel
ils se sentent
guilty, they feel
coupables, ils se
judged,
sentent jugés, ils ont
they
tendance à se juger
self-judged
eux-mêmes.
as well,
Et aussi, soit qu'ils
or
décrochent des
they
médias
may
sociaux,
take a
décident de
leave.
prendre des pauses. Certains
Some
envisagent de
decide
changer de
to
carrière.
totally change
On peut
career.
malheureusement pas
We
mesurer
cannot
combien
measure
ont
how
changé
many
de carrière,
people
puisqu'on
have
parlait aux gens qui sont en ce moment, qui font
shifted
partie
their profession.
des médias en ce moment. Mais
We
on sait qu'il y en
are
a
aware, though, that
et
some
aussi,
people
donc, il y a
quit.
beaucoup de
The
conséquences
consequences
au
of
harcèlement.
harassment
Ce sont
are
des
therefore
conséquences très importantes, très
important,
personnelles.
personal.
Et on voit aussi, quand on regarde, parmi ceux qui nous disent
We
que
can also
qui sont
see
victimes de harcèlement
among the
très
people who
fréquemment,
have
que
been
presque
a
à toutes
victim
les
of
semaines,
harassment
on
almost in a
voit que
weekly
les
manner, we
proportions
can see
sont
that the
beaucoup plus
proportions are
élevées
much
ici.
higher.
Donc,
So
plus
the
on est victime
more
d'harcèlement, plus les
harassment, the
conséquences personnelles
dire
sont grandes et on a
the
tendance à
personal
choisir nos sujets,
consequences. So we
éviter
would
d'en
avoid
parler.
talking about
Il y
it
a
and
beaucoup de
all the
conséquences.
other mental health consequences
And
associated
now
to it.
if we look at what
What we have
people
here
are doing about
is what people
harassment,
do
online.
about the online
And
harassment.
as was mentioned in the previous panel, unfortunately, there's a large majority about half people say they don't report any acts of harassment. And when we ask them why, the vast majority of them say, I didn't feel it was serious enough. And we heard earlier Grégoire mention that it's not part of the job. It should not be part of the job. Well, what we're seeing in those results is that for many, they consider it to be part of the job or not really worthy of them taking the time to report this. But also, in second, very important, is people did not believe that anything would be done if they did report the incident. And importantly here is that once again, we see that the most vulnerable groups are the ones who tend to either not report it or say, I did not think that it would make a difference if I reported it. So they feel even less supported than people who are not part of those more vulnerable groups. So this is very important. And then going down the list, did not know who reported to, did not feel comfortable, felt guilty, which is something that we've heard also previously. So all these reasons are coming up as reasons why people are not reporting some of the harassment that they've been facing. And among those who did try to access resources, and we see that 64% of them did not. So among those who said I was victimized, only 64% say I did not try to access any resources. Among those who did, generally speaking, they're not really satisfied with the help that they've received. So in blue are the percentage of people who say that they've received adequate support. The yellow line is kind of in between neutral, and then the darker gray means inadequate or don't know for the lighter gray. And what we see is that on none of those types of resources really garnered a majority of support or a majority of people who said, yeah, I received adequate help or assistance when I turn to those resources. So there's work to be done to improve how things are happening. And as we saw previously, there's work to be done to make sure that people are aware of the resources that they can use and that it can make a difference. And when we ask, and open-ended, we ask people, respondents, what could be done to better support those who are victimized? And what we see is that it's kind of a mix of responses, education, awareness, various recourses, and then better management of comments or fake accounts online. So it's kind of a mixed bag of what solutions could be put forward, but about half say, I don't know. They really don't know what solutions are available or what could be done to really change the situation. And that's an important factor. And it's a question that I know I've been asked often, what should we do about all of this in past few years? And many of you will relate to the fact that it's very hard to find a simple or a good answer. It's a very complex issue. And this is what is reflected in the results that we're seeing here. And who is responsible for protecting those who are victims of online harassment? And we see here that a vast majority of those who responded turned to their employers, saying that, you know, employers should be the one responsible, or at least in part responsible, for helping out those who are victimized. Social media platforms bear a lot of responsibility, according to respondents, but so do government. The majority say that, you know, various government levels should play a role in helping out and trying to reduce the prevalence of this problem. And then journalists associations, governing bodies, unions are also pointed out as key institutions who could help out, but it really goes to employers and social media platforms first and foremost. Now, you know, I've already presented the conclusions to start with, and I won't, you know, if I'm going to finish this properly, I think I need to leave it into the own words of those who responded. So I'm presenting to you just some of the quotes that we've got while we did the surveys on open and question about what, you know, how do you feel, what have you done, how have you reacted to all of this? And we see that it has impacted their ability to work effectively, self-doubt, anxiety, changing the way we cover stories, asked to be reassigned to other topics so that we can avoid getting involved in controversial issues. So things that really attack the core of the profession of being journalists. We also see an exodus of voices where people say, I've left journalism. It wasn't worth the energy. It wasn't worth the sacrifices. I switched to more behind the scenes role. I did not want to be so public facing anymore. Published work without my byline. Again, an important decision for people who work at trying to protect democracy, uncover key stories. You have to, some feel that they need to hide to do this. And of course, fear for personal safety, going as far as saying that I check for suspicious vehicles wherever I go. I check for people around me. I moved out of my home province because I was facing too much harassment. And you know, we could go down this list, and this is just a snapshot. We've got so many other, you know, telling quotes. So all this really gives you a sense of what people are facing, and really represents what we've heard in the previous panel. So I'll stop on this.
Wow. Thank you so much, Sébastien. I think so many were just so, I'm so moved by what you present, because all the way through your presentation, I could hear the voices of the different panelists, whether it was this morning or last week, and in so many ways has corroborated and just shown us and confirmed for anyone that still has doubt that these are not isolated incidents that have really important impacts on people's lives, and the urgency for us to move together as an industry certainly is so important. So I'm going to ask you to stand by and stay with us, because I'm sure that a lot of people still have questions or comments. Je vous invite encore une fois.
I'm inviting you once again, if you have reactions, questions, or comments, please feel free to click on the button Q&A and answer and make your comments there.
So I'm going to invite, of course, our representatives from the industry to join us in the conversation. And I think it would be great to, I'm going to want to hear from everyone, of course, but start with you, Irene, just to hear if you could give us just your immediate reaction to what we just heard.
I have a lot of thoughts on what we just heard. One is to echo again the seriousness of it. Like, from what this shows is that this has serious impacts both on people's lives and well-being and on the industry. I think it's also incredibly important that we have this information for the first time in a Canadian context, because you can't fix what you can't see. And we've all been talking individually about this. This puts it together in a place that you cannot or should not ignore. I think it also really shows the existential nature of this. Like, I really think we can't stress that enough. We saw from this that people are leaving the industry or changing how they do their jobs because of this. Think of who is being targeted. The people who are being targeted are the ones who are trying to bring journalism into relevance for the community into the future. They're trying to bring it to create journalism for everybody, as opposed to some of the criticisms of journalism in the past, where it wasn't really doing that. Those are the voices that are most at risk with this sort of thing. And I think that the survey shows that as well. Trust is a huge issue. Again, if we go back to, some felt that nothing would have happened. No, it wasn't serious enough to report. Sorry, that one. That again goes back to the old journalism culture, or the culture I think that we're still trying to change, of, it's just a thick skin. It's just the way things are. It isn't a thick skin. It isn't the way things are or should be anyway. So again, the culture, the need for us to be able to normalize not thick skin, but normalize that this is not okay. I think that shows it as well. And then there's the trust within the organizations themselves. So again, who is most being targeted by online hate are also the people who I think routinely, historically, have not felt as supported by their own organizations or the industry. So it's a double failure. And that's another reason we've got to really try to work on the culture aspect of it. And then the trust that nothing will be done. I think that's the one that scares many of us the most. And sometimes it's because the organization hasn't caught up to again, the normalizing that this is not okay. But a lot of times it is the response seems wholly inadequate. And every time we try to bring in a new arsenal or a new way to respond, it still can sometimes feel inadequate. And that's partly because while there's a huge responsibility with the employers, as was seen in this survey, that's what people think as well, there is also, the laws haven't caught up. The judicial system is not actually prepared for what's actually happening out there. Governments are not taking it, their laws are not prepared for what's happening out there. So again, this collaboration is because we need to get beyond our own individual responses. Our own individual responses are not going to be enough in the end. And then I guess just the last thing, when it said that most journalists are targeted first and foremost for being journalists, which is true. Or I would assume to be true. I think what is clear, at least anecdotally from what many of us have seen through our journalists who have been targeted, is it gets personal very quickly. It moves off of anything to do with journalism immediately and goes to a very particular, it's about you and who you are and why I don't think you should be able to speak.
Wow. Thank you for that, Irene. There's so much more I feel like to unpack, and so many questions that I'd like to follow up on, and I'm going to come back to you in a minute, but I want to give everybody the opportunity to react.
You, Marie-Andrée, I think there's so many things to say. I think that we feel a lot of emotions to say that we're shocked, but it seems to confirm what we heard otherwise. And it brings us back with the importance of acting and moving. I can't wait to hear your reactions and your thoughts on what we just heard regarding the survey. Well, it's a report that is necessary, but really troubling, very honestly. We're leaving this presentation with in a maybe more pessimistic, I would say, a little bit, but we really have to love this profession to continue to practice it. When we know that only a quarter of the population is trusting us, at the same time for a article written by the simple fact of being a woman or a minority, whether gender or ethnic, we are the attack target. So I'm concluding that we really have to love this work. I know that the people who are still working are passionate. What troubling me before more than anything else, I'm in agreement with everything that Irene said. What what really hits me as an employer in media is the paradox of that a lot of journalists experience this phenomenon, and just a small minority talk about it. I think that it should really reach us, it should really touch us as employers. I'm in agreement with Irene. What's most troubling, that people don't know, actually, are not convinced that there is a solution. And I think that our greatest challenge as an industry is to know and to see above these very negative statistics, to see what path we can find to find a solution, the light at the end of the tunnel. Because when looking at this objectively, we're seeing that employees are facing dead ends with the employer, because maybe the employer is not taking this seriously, with a dead end with the government, maybe with the police. What's the point of making a complaint, because maybe it's not going to make it any difference. So thank you, Mr. Dallaire, for your presentation. That's convincing me that I have to be much more present in a very proactive way with employees, so that they're convinced that I know that it's a problem, and that it reminds us the importance to find ways to work together, to stop seeing the question that is simply an organizational one. It's the entire industry that has to be mobilized. I was also shocked by the frequency when we're looking at the 2/3 of the people that were touched on daily, even 6%. Kenny, over to you.
Kenny, over to you. I think, I just want to hear your reactions. Like your colleagues, it's been really a confirmation of what we've been hearing since the beginning of this forum and before, and a call to action. Definitely, I think you would agree with that, right?
Yeah, I mean the survey. I've consumed a lot of surveys in my life, and you usually don't know who is behind the survey. Like, this is us. There's 1,000+ fellow Canadians within our industry are telling us that they're hurting. And I would add, I read through some of the feelings and the hurt, and I add pandemic and isolation to that. And so I feel that has been a fuel to this issue, that in the past we would have had newsrooms and gatherings to support each other, and now we're so disconnected. And I feel that so deeply in terms of the things that we're hearing. I think Irene, and I think everything has been said has been bang on. I think for me, where I think about it is the term harassment has been gone through a journey, I think, right? And internally, a lot of folks do not report for many reasons. And one of the reasons is why is some of the attacks are feeling they're not sure where to put it into context. And I like the conversation we're having at CBC about the word harm. And the word harm is important because it doesn't tether yourself to the legal system. It doesn't connect necessarily into a law. It's about what is the impact on the person. And when we start to say that harming, which is included under the bigger harassment umbrella, is something that we should act on regardless of what the laws, which are outdated, regardless of what the politicians and the legal system is telling us, that we have a duty to act on the harm piece. And so in framing it under harm, it means that a lot of those narratives of how folks are being treated digitally in the past may have been that thick skin, move along, this is something you're dealing with every day. I think we're now looking at it from a different perspective, is that actually what you're experiencing is wrong. You shouldn't have to deal with it, and also we have to deal with it and help you through it. Trust is something that we think about deeply, and the misinformation conversations we've been having as an industry. We've been having very nebulous and intellectual conversations about the public trust in journalism and journalists. What we're seeing here is that trust is being felt at the front line, right? Those of us at the executive level may be looking at brand surveys or looking at the delta between the 2 points and drop of trust in journalists, but it's actually our folks who are feeling it every day. right now. So it's not just a barometer that will put a survey out. It is what our folks are feeling. And so we do have a duty in terms of thinking about, as an industry, how do we work on that piece? And I think when we talk about solutions, it's one of the things that we know is fueling this fire. And I think for the final thing to sort of lean on is our employees are telling us that they look to us, right? And they're very right to do so. It was the industry leaders who decided to get in with the platforms. It was strategic decisions to get our content to where audiences were living. And these were decisions we were making 10, 12 years ago when we thought, let's get our folks on the Twitter. Let's think about what our strategy is for Facebook. So it is very much within our control in terms of asking our staff that in order to become storytellers, that you got to be in the digital spaces. So to rewind the clock and go forward 12 years, it very much lands within our purview to sort of think about the decisions and choices we did make as an industry, as organizations, to be in these spaces. So what is our duty as a result of those? And then we have choices to make going forward, right? And that those are things that we think about in how we grapple the situation.
Wow, thank you for that, Kenny. There's so much to do, but in the end, in the beginning, you know, people are hurting and we have to be able to move on that. And that should be really what's inspiring us to really move forward and find solutions on that. We have some questions, but I want to let Brent, I want to give you the opportunity to react first. And then I'll have a question from our participants that I'd like to put to you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Absolutely. I mean, I think what we heard from Sebastien is a reflection of a lot of the same things that we've, that we're familiar with, and put a sort of quantitative bent to it. I mean, I think that, at the end of the day, if there is no such thing as journalism without journalists. And ultimately, that is what we have to keep in mind, that these are the individuals who are producing this. They're providing a public service, and they're also putting themselves in harm's way, clearly, to be able to serve this higher purpose. And I think that it's incumbent on us, all of us, whether it's an association like the CAJ or FPGQ or news organizations, we all have to work in lockstep on this. This is not there's no, we all win when we work together on this. This is not, the success or the failure of our approach and how we combat this will be reflective of how well we can collaborate. And I think we're seeing really strong signs of that in editorial production, things like the Pandora Papers and the Panama Papers and all these big collaborative investigations. That's great. But now we're talking about, looking into our own backyard. And I think that we really need to be cognizant of that. And if we can adopt some of the same approaches that we've developed in best practices over the last few years in doing these major investigations into how we support media workers, I think that'll go a long way to helping fix things.
Yeah. And I know you had the opportunity to have a similar discussion a couple of weeks back. I'm going to give you the opportunity to tell us a little bit on this issue about what some of the takeaways were from that discussion. I don't know who it's from, but here's a question. We can all be united that trolls and abusers, faceless as they are, should be stopped. Could someone please comment on what organizations can do to stop our industry colleagues who lead the pylon of abuse, often on social media? Who would like to jump in on that question? I was looking at you, Irene, or Brent, would you go ahead?
I mean, I think to what I was saying just a moment ago, I think it's incumbent on all of us, whether it's associations, employers. I mean, one of the things that we heard in the seminar that we did with Carleton University a couple of weeks ago was that, there is a strong reflection on employers to handle this, but there's also roles of associations, and I see, in Sebastien's numbers there, 30% look at associations for who to address these problems. And I regularly am on the phone with people, and I hear before I go to bed at night, rethinking about people's stories that are shared with me, and what can I do to try and make this situation better. And that's why I think it really underscores that we all need we all need to do something. This is not going to be won by one group or one news organization or one association. It's going to be all of us working together, and that's going to be the measure of the success or failure.
Yeah, absolutely. So can you take, oh, sorry.
I'm hoping I've got the question correctly to try to answer it, but I think aside from everything that Brent already said, we have to find a way to depoliticize this. Like we even within, like I'm not sure if it meant if that question, sorry, was meant within an individual organization. There are people within the organization who are fomenting within the organization, or if it's other media outlets that could create pylons. And again, so first of all, I think greater awareness of what this is, and what, you know, what was earlier, an earlier panelist said, like, not everyone knows what a pylon is. Well, if you've experienced it, you really know what a pylon is, and really it's not a good thing. So awareness overall over what it is and what harm it causes may be able to help. But I also think, like, take the politics out of this. This ultimately isn't really about politics. Like we've all made it look like it's about politics for whatever reason. It's got the veneer or sheen of politics, but it's about much broader social issues. It's about a much broader social contract, social way of being. So I mean, again, this talk. The one that Brent's about to talk about, the event that happened there, this event here, making sure these conversations are having through like all levels within our own organizations, trying to raise awareness of the impact, which again, I think the survey will go a far way to do, and also to like call it out when it's not about journalism a lot of the times. It truly isn't. It isn't about politics a lot of the times. Call it out, like just call it out for what it is.
That's interesting. I'm going to bring things over to you, Brent, but before we do, I don't mean before we do, after that, I'd like to hear a little bit more as to specifics as to where do we start after we get that information. But Brent, can you walk us through a little bit your takeaways? You had a similar conversation, as I was saying a few minutes ago, with Carleton University's journalism school. What were some of the takeaways from the discussion that took place a couple of weeks back?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what we did was we broke the morning down. It was a morning session into 4 topics, looking at the workplace, hearing from journalists individually, looking at law enforcement or enforcement, and community security and self-care. So those were some of the key points that we went off of and had discussions based on those. I did want to start, you know, I know Sebastien had some anecdotes in his presentation, but I think it's really important to again, you know, just make sure that the voices of those mostly directly impacted by this are heard. We've heard from them last week. We've heard some more today, but I'm cognizant that I'm here as people's proxy, and I think it's only appropriate to share them with you. So, you know, we asked, the panelists in the first session were asked how they would describe the feelings that they had when the messages first started coming in, whether via Twitter or email. And you can see here, I mean, some of the very poignant and precise nature of the comments that were made, and that it is, you know, paralyzing and frightening, and all of these. So you're seeing a panoply of emotions being expressed in this, and that it's a very human reaction. So despite, you know, having a high level conversation like we are today, it does trickle down right to the individual. And I think we need to be very cognizant of addressing, as was discussed earlier, you know, making sure that we have the individual taken care of and reviewed. So,
so what did we do in the first session? What was the context? So we understood that the hateful messages were part often of more broader campaigns of harassment and intimidation and bullying. So being the trauma linked to the reception of these messages is increased by the isolation and lack of support. It seems to the entire, and we also have, people who are minorities, they suffer a lot with that. So in the sense of the isolation and lack of support, showed that the abuse has a cumulative effect. So if you're isolated, the abuse is going to affect the very important work that you're doing. So all this has this cumulative effect, and it has a big effect. And also a panelist mentioned, I should not have to take care of this alone, because it's not up to me to go to court. It's all of our jobs to correct this error. So I just wanted to cite this comment, because everybody should work on this to find solutions. We also heard today that this trauma does involve the entire community, and very important repercussions on Canadian journalism's stand in the balance. So this is a very important thing that we're hearing, is that journalists will actually leave that work, or just stop doing the hard, part of that hard journalistic work that needs to be done. We also spoke about the workplace. So a lot of journalists do live this experience, but usually they're not supported by their institutions and by their colleagues sufficiently. So this is unfortunate, but it is a very precise reality. We also heard that some racialized journalists created their own community that are experiencing these situations. For example, when someone has they create a community to support someone who's in this type of crisis. Also, when journalists are not able to do their work and freely. So we're finding that so then if they don't feel safe, they can't do their public service work. The next one, we also heard that a management that takes into account trauma is necessary. And that's obvious. We have to be more proactive to develop those types of policies. We also have to allow journalists to determine their own level of engagement in various places where they can receive hateful messaging. And one of the things that we heard is from a media organization is that maybe journalists they don't need to be on social media if they don't want to. So it shouldn't be a requirement for their work. And I think that it's a perspective that is ignorant. The interpreter might have misunderstood. So there should be a proactive and preventative supports for all workers and all staff, and engagement from the directors. And so, like we heard before, the security of the employees really depends on the employers. But some people say that we don't want to worsen the problem, so let's ignore it, for example. But it's a mindset that is changing right now, and I'm conscious of that. But we have to think that there are vestiges of this type of, way of thinking in some of the newsrooms. And I also spoke about the clear policies and pre-established protocols have to be established so that organizations are not in a tough spot. And also newsrooms examine how their own coverage will reinforce prejudices or perpetuate. It's something much broader than what we're discussing today, but they should be conscious of that as well. And also supporting freelance workers is also necessary. Oftentimes freelancers do not have access to counsel, and we have to be conscious to develop solutions and to keep in mind equity and our priorities.
On the law enforcement side, we talked a little bit about the lack of clarity that exists, for example, in how these threats are documented, and how individuals experience violence and what is actually actionable. For example, there's a really high threshold for laying charges for local events like hatred, the incitement of genocide, and that's something that we need to be aware of in bringing things to the courts. Irene also sort of alluded to this earlier. And that the people who are sending these kind of messages also are very conscious of the where the lines are in terms of inciting particular violence or threats. It's a very delicate line that people are walking. We did hear that one thing that was a pretty interesting approach was how people should think about this in sort of context of domestic violence. For example, when we talk about domestic violence, we don't say the person who's the victim, and that it's their responsibility solely. We talk about community solutions instead. And I think that also just underscores a lot of the work that we need to do here. There's definitely a knowledge gap between journalists and law, as Irene mentioned. And we also heard quite a bit about the justified lack of trust between Black journalists and law enforcement, in terms of how law enforcement pathologizes Black people, for example, or to dismiss the safety concerns of Black people for whatever reason. And also the mistrust that some Black journalists might have, because, from the time that they began their career, they've been experiencing online harassment, and law enforcement bodies haven't done anything to act on that. And maybe now that, that we're seeing this explode into not just into different demographics and different groups of people, maybe that will accelerate some action, and at least one can hope. But the point that law enforcement doesn't engender a ton of trust with Black journalists is something that I think is the key takeaway here. Lastly, just the security, community, and self-care. I think proactive is a key word here that we can keep hammering away at and developing campaigns. The need for support in newsrooms to secure journalists' online presences, for example, having digital security training sort of embedded in that, in the core curriculum, if you will. Online harassment being a press freedom issue, we've heard about that as well. And also just sort of taking stock and making sure that everything that is done reaches freelancers as well as staffers, because there is that inequality or inequity. And so one of the things that we heard was sort of the best kind of self-care is stopping the problem in the first place, just to put a really fine point on it. And I'd just like to plug a survey that's currently in the field right now, if I may, for 5 seconds. It's been done by Dave Seglins and from the CBC, and Matthew Pearson from Carleton's Journalism School. It's called Taking Care, and it's really important, and I hope that everyone will follow up and complete it, because this is the first of its kind survey like this in Canada to really help us diagnose what these issues are and how we can go about fixing them, because this is a huge piece of that puzzle. I'd end with saying, if you are a victim, if you do experience, I apologize, if you experience online harassment, the first call that I would suggest you make is always to your editor. But the second call us, the CAJ, because I think we have some resources that we can help you with as well.
Merci. Merci pour ça, Brent, pour toute la présentation. Je pense qu'on a
Thank you very much for this presentation. We can really see the importance to highlight the impact of these experiences, and this really stands out in the report, along with the follow-ups to do. I would like to thank you, Sébastien Dallaire, for your presentation of the survey. As you can see, the reactions are numerous. This time, we do not want only a reaction, but a true mobilization for follow-up. Though with what I hear today, I can put on my positive lens And we can see in the results of the survey that we want to act and find solutions. Marie-André, I would like to turn to you again for one of the sides is that the fact that journalists are always afraid to talk about it because they're afraid of the inadequate situation response. We come back about the importance of developing an environment where journalists can feel free to speak and that they can feel trust that there's going to be a follow-up after they disclose. I am absolutely convinced that this is a crucial step for all companies who really want to address this major issue. We first must create a space, whatever space, where the staffers and journalists wish to really underline that staffers are important. For example, the people who take care of comment moderation are also facing harassment. So we must develop a space where people can disclose, speak up, and so forth. I think the first step is to talk and name this issue and to send a signal to the journalists and the staffers, as was seen earlier in the survey, that many think this is part of their job. Jason, I think you illustrated it really well, the evolution of our career from the time when we had a very good conversation with our audience and we were criticized to improve. Now we're in a space where we're targets and the aim is just to silence us and to have us disappear, whether it's our voice or physical presence. Therefore, again, this is the first step. I would like to clarify again that all the press industries are not at the same level. I notice, as I have been listening to you for the past 2 amazing sessions, some companies are already involved for the past 10 years. For us, this is not the case. This is a phenomenon that we recognize and react to only since recently. Therefore, I feel that when forecasting all the different solutions, we want to see, for example, that some media organizations do not have large safety teams, for example. Even though we are small like us, we only have 40 journalists, we must make sure that most people are safe, whether we have 1, 2, 10, or 30. The impact on someone's life is dire. So the solution must be found for a small group or a large group. I think this is really important to remember that when we follow up. And I turn to you all because you have an obvious expertise. And I do feel that if we work hand in hand, we can be winners. You are so right. The importance of solidarity is crucial. I'm not sure which panelists last week said that we may have the impression to be pulling backwards and not to be at the same level with the others, though the situation evolves so quickly that we find ourselves ourselves to start over and start working together again. I think it is really important to come back to this solidarity and to see how we can join forces.
I could go on for
the future.
Really hours listening to you, but because I think this is such an important conversation. But I want to, before we conclude and hear from everybody again, I want to give Kenny you the opportunity to talk about the task force, because I understand at CBC that you've been behind putting a task force together to address these issues. And again, with respect to making sure that there's a platform and there's a way to make sure that we close that gap between management and the experience, as Marie-Andrée reminded me, not just journalists, that media professionals are dealing with. Can you tell us a little bit about how that works and how that was put together?
I think the important thing we started with was buy-in from the top. You know, our president got a lot of narrative from our staff over the last year plus and decided to make it a priority for the company. And, you know, there's a lot of work we do at various levels, but to have the leadership say, this is important, I will pour my resources and my priorities toward it, was a meaningful move. And so the task force was set up to sort of start to look at the fact that it is a nuanced issue that needs many, many approaches. And so there's much work happening across departments as a result of that. You know, the way I describe this issue, you know, it's not an editorial issue. It's not just a legal issue. It's not a government connection, law enforcement issue. It's not even just a security risk assessment issue, HR issue. It is all those functions within, in our context, a large organization. That a lot of the work that had been happening had been, I would term it, side of your desk, passionate side of your desk, but you're doing it alone. And I think what we have the opportunity is to bring all those experts who have been chipping away at it to say, this is now the work, right? This is not 10% time. It's not like fit in a meeting and once a month. This is the work we're going to commit to. And so as a result of it is getting the folks who are with the leadership leading the way, having those difficult conversations across the industry, holding events like this, but then also at various other levels to start to think through, you know, what is our approach to security? How do we onboard new staff? How do we create a safer ecosystem within our emails? How do we think about moderation and the people who read that? And then how do we connect our work with the platforms? Right, we do many relationships with the platforms, whether it's revenue or distribution or even just chatting with them and thinking about them as players in the industry. And so all that comes to those single voices that we've had that were so long about kind of that the distinctive. One of the things I do becomes one of the big things I do, and I think that was an important tone to set. So that's my encouragement: is you get the leadership to recognize that it is an issue and start to say, go, guess what? The rest of the organization will move. And I think we're seeing the start of that. Said at a prior, we're at kind of a start line that gets reset all the time. You know, no one is behind. I think there are those of us who have been working on it and finding that there are now headway we're making. And I think, to be said, learnings across industries, across to different organizations, that it's pretty crucial. You know, hey, did you hear that this news organization is trying this approach? Why don't we try that too? Can we share some intel? Can we talk about how you're approaching it? I think that goes a long way to help us, because we need to get quick in terms of how we act to that, and trying to find a internal solution without having to bounce it off other leaders and other organizations who are doing the same work. I think, you know, that's an opportunity we don't want to miss.
Absolutely. But on that note, I'm going to ask you, Irene, like, you know, and I was going through or writing down as you were speaking about all of the different aspects that are addressed during this forum, from the poll, whether it's, you know, government and law enforcement, depoliticizing, polarization. It's so daunting. It's hard to know where to start, but we have to keep moving, keep it moving and act into what Kenny was talking about, the importance of sharing best practices and those opportunities. Can you enlighten us on how you see us, maybe even as we going forward? How can we do better on that aspect?
Yes, and I just want to applaud Kenny's side of the desk. That's a word or a phrase I kept wanting to say too. That is still where it is for a lot of places and people, and until it becomes forefront, it will continue to happen. But addressing what both actually our guest just recently said is, media is not unified. We're not monolithic, is what I mean. There are big organizations, there's small organizations, there's different mandates, there's all kinds of different things, but that doesn't change the impact of this on every single organization being the same. Therefore, best practices. One thing that we need to do is to get together like the CAJ Carleton event, and then outside of that, build on that so that we can learn from each other, the gaps in our own systems. I learned today from this, from Inga, I think it was, about the pre-planning. I learned from that. I wrote everything down, right? And I'm going to bring that back to our newsroom. So that was a gap in something that we were doing. And then there's the sharing too. So not every organization is going to be able to resource security training. Is there an organization that has the resources that actually could help that other organization with that training? Does it have to be within our own walls when it's something that actually hits so many? So where can we find the generosity within ourselves to collaborate in this ways? As Brent said, we've done it with investigations, with Panama Paradise, etc. We've also done it with things like pub bans. We used to all go and do document fights on our own so that we could get the exclusive when it was over. And then there's obviously lots of financial issues within the industry, and we thought, well, this is stupid. We just want the information to be free. So we all got together in order to share the cost and to share the benefits of that. This is another area where we could do something like that. Once we've all learned the best practices though, and we've taken it seriously, we've taken offside of the desk, once all that has happened, I still think there's 60% of the issue at least is still out there, right? And that is again, that there are no laws that adequately address this. Law enforcement, even when there are laws, it's fractured, it's like you must report into the area where you got the threat. Well, what if the threat is actually across Canada with 50 different people, 50 different people being targeted? Going to your individual police station is really not going to effectively change that. So again, so there's that. And then there is the platform issue. No matter how much that we are tied with them in various different ways, and no matter how much good they can sometimes do in other contexts, without a unified presence going to them, without a unified voice, if we're all going to the different social media sites or whatever on our own as organizations or as journalists asking for change, that allows change to not happen. That allows the status quo to continue. The only way to stop that is if we don't do it in that way, and we don't approach the judicial parts of it in the way of each individual police station. We need to be able to figure out, how do we as a group come together and say, we know that this is a big gap. We are not set up, this country is not set up for this. How can we as a group petition, I guess, in some ways, in a journalistically ethical way, in order to do that? And it doesn't have to only be through stories. There is just the power of the group that I don't think have done a great job so far at, and hopefully that's beginning to change.
And hopefully it is beginning to change. And I certainly see the enthusiasm and a willingness here today for us to happen. On that note, unfortunately, we're out of time. I think you set the table for the next discussion, all of you.
Thank you very much, Irene, Marie-André, Brent, Kenny. This is the end of this forum. I really want to warmly thank you for this conversation and your contribution. It's really enlightening to hear you. I would like also to thank the speakers for the November 2 event, our first session. It was a very enriching session. Thanks to you, thanks to the findings of this survey, we feel that this forum has really triggered an interest of the attacks the journalists and media staffers face. There's 72%. This number really stuck with me. That represents lots of people, and we are responsible, collectively responsible to react. Canada is not an exception. We are facing the same problem as everywhere else, but that would be helpful with the digital platform and to lean on concrete actions. Therefore, our work is not complete as of yet. During this forum, we also talked about very sensitive topics that may resonate with your own experiences. If this is so, please turn to someone you trust or use the available resources in your organization. In Canada, you can also reach the Crisis Service Center in Canada.
Sur ce, je vous dis merci.
Je vous...
Now back over to you, Hannah.
Merci, Yolande. Thank you. Gosh, I don't know about any of you, but this has been such an emotive and interesting and powerful set of conversations, and I feel so immensely privileged to be part of this. So thank you. While this forum might be coming to a close, I strongly believe that our work to address the threats against media professionals is gaining momentum, as we've heard today. It's so great to hear from our panelist colleagues that collaborative efforts are underway, and it was so great to hear last week about the experiences, and so brave of our colleagues to share their experiences of online harm. I'm just going to take a couple of moments to attempt to summarize some of what we've heard in the last couple of weeks. It's been done so professionally and so wonderfully by our colleagues already, but just if you could just bear with me for a couple of moments. What we heard today is this is something that is having a significant impact on individuals and our industry. These, I often hear the term in mental health conversations, these are human beings we're talking about, not human doings. Often we get the sense that journalists are part of a machine, but these are human beings impacted by harm. And I specifically liked Kenny's point about, let's reframe this in terms of thinking about it as a harm. And that's really important. Then holistically, we can think about how do we proceed to this conversation in terms of thinking about it in all its different aspects, how they intersect physical, emotional, online violence as well. We know that those journalists who are often most marginalized by our industry and by society are those who are most impacted by this as well. And I think that's something really, really important to know. I don't know about you, I've already heard from some of you that, you know, the results of this survey, I was really saddened by them, but not surprised at all. And I think this is a real incentive for us to take action. We're hearing that people, as I said, are impacted. We're hearing that people are leaving the industry, they're self-censoring, they're stopping doing certain stories. Some people are feeling blamed, you know, that it's their fault, that they're a liability. And we heard the way that intersects with conversations around gendered violence as well. So just a couple of things, we do need to act on this. I think the leadership question is so important, but also needing to offer support to our leaders, Yolande, as well. I mean, we heard there from your colleagues how important that was.
Yeah, that's a huge part of it. I think, like you, Hannah, it's so hard to take in, but we're not surprised by what we've heard. And if we're thinking about, you know, how can we put light on this situation, is to recognize the problem and to be able to have the support in the right place, so that those that are being harmed, journalists and media professionals, have confidence. You know, the issue of confidence was huge for us today in leadership and in the ability of leadership to respond and support them adequately. If anything, I think that there is, I don't want to say more than consensus. We're unanimous in understanding that that is the most urgent of issues, and it's so complex on so many ways. But I think that there is certainly a takeaway from today, is that we need to, as an industry, move on that. Absolutely.
Yeah, and leaders need, you know, leaders need support too. We know it's been an incredibly stressful period of time for leaders too, and we need support too as leaders. So just to, I mean, and we heard the organizations are at different levels in terms of resourcing. So I think that's a really, really great way of being able to say, we are working together, we must work together. And I think looking ahead, we need to focus on deepening existing partnerships and implementing some of the suggestions of this forum. As a first step, we'll be turning our conference website, notok.cetace.ca, into a permanent resource for media professionals who are subject to online harm, or those who want to support their colleagues. And tools will include links to research into the subject, the findings of the Ipsos survey, you'll be able to find that on there, and links to recordings from this forum. In all my years of working in journalism safety, I have come to understand that we cannot guarantee journalism. If we cannot guarantee journalism safety, we cannot guarantee press freedom. So I think it's really important to think about that as well. And because of that, we want to hold ourselves accountable. Looking ahead to World Press Freedom Day on May the 3rd, we are committed to giving feedback in terms of some tangible responses to what we've heard today, some actions. So we're also going to be creating spaces, and we heard that from Kenny as well and from various other colleagues, to underscore the importance of solidarity. We'll be holding national workshops for journalists, their managers and news leaders over the next months. And we'll also be putting together cross-organisational working groups to build on our efforts. We invite you all to be part of that. Yolande, it's been an absolute pleasure working with you. I know we will be working together to help support our colleagues and work in this space much more in the future. But on behalf, merci beaucoup, merci beaucoup. On behalf of both of us, thank you all for your presence and commitment. We look forward to seeing continued progress in making work safer online for all media professionals. Merci beaucoup, and until next time. Thank you.